leading up to Christmas, the Christmas holiday, asking the question, okay, who is this Jesus guy really? As you can see, he's got a lot of titles. He's got a lot of ways that people know him, the way that the New Testament refers to him. But each of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have a distinct way in which they want us to know who Jesus is. And their distinct way is brought about by the way in which they introduce him to us. They each have a distinct way to introduce Jesus to us. Last week we looked at the book of John, and he introduced Jesus to us before there was a history, prehistorical Jesus. That Jesus was this word of God, and God spoke this word, very sort of cosmological. And Luke, we'll get to next week, it has the baby Jesus and the birth narrative and the shepherds, and we'll get into what that implication is. Today, though, Matthew introduces us to Jesus with this extremely long list of names. And I didn't read all the names for you because it just would have put some of you to sleep right away. I skipped, if you noticed, some of the names. But the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 1, the very beginning, Matthew wants us to see, listen, if you want to know who Jesus is, you have to know first where he comes from and who he comes from. Because only in that context will you have a proper understanding and shaping of who Jesus is and what he's going to do in this world. And of course, this list of names is we call it a genealogy. And genealogies, it's hard for us maybe because we don't use this, right? Like if I meet you at church, I don't say, hi, I'm Aric, son of Larry, son of Samuel, son of Robert. It's like, you would look at me weird, right? I'm Aric, son of Larry, son of Samuel, son of Robert. It's like Game of Thrones or something. It doesn't fit within our context, right? We don't do that. What we do is, when we meet somebody, what do you do? What's your job? Because that's the way we classify people, right? We understand them, or we ask them maybe, where are you from? Then we know, oh, you're from that place. Oh, now I know you. Matthew, though, says, if you want to know who Jesus is, you know first where he comes from in his family. And you have to know his family line. You have to know his genealogy. And at this time, genealogies acted more like what I'm going to call a resume. A genealogy at this time, listing out your family's background, your family's names, was more like a resume. And in fact, what happens, just like our modern day resumes, some information gets left out and some information gets added in. And they do it because they want you to know the person in a distinctive way. Let me give you an example of this. King Herod, who's in the Bible, King Herod the Great, he fudged his genealogy. Historically, Josephus reports that what he did was he took certain people out of it because they weren't kingly, they weren't royal blood. And why did he do that? Because he wanted to say, listen, I'm the king, I'm great, so let's get rid of those names. And it works really the same way that resumes work for you and I today. Let's be honest, people, today. Everybody who's ever filled out a resume has left some information off and put some information on, and you tend to leave off the information that's going to be a little embarrassing, or that information you're going to have to explain. You know, if you didn't finish school at this particular university, let's leave that off the resume, right? Don't have to ask about that. This is what genealogies did. They did the same exact thing here, except in Jesus' genealogy, in the list of his names and the way in which Matthew introduces us to him, he does the exact opposite. He puts people into the genealogy of Jesus that you and I not only would never expect, but if we were a first century Jewish person reading this, we would say, this is scandalous. You're calling this guy the Messiah, and you say this is who he came from? Not a chance. These people are losers in his genealogies. These people are moral failures. These people are sinners. These people are outsiders. And if you're sitting around Matthew, pretend you're Matthew for a little bit, and you're sitting around with your buddies, and you're writing this book, and you say, you know, it'd be great if we had a new religion right now. Let's make a new religion. We need order, we need rules, we need some morality here. Let's make a new religion. And so you sit around with your buddies and you say, okay, okay, we need a king. Okay, Jesus, this guy Jesus, he'll do. Pick him, okay. And you sit down and you have to now prove that Jesus is who he says he was. And so Matthew writes down this long list of names, all these people, the father of this, the father of that, the father of this. And he takes that piece of paper down to the local temple. And he says, look, this proves that Jesus was the Messiah. I'll tell you what they would have done. At the very least, they would have laughed at them. At the very worst, they would have ripped that paper up. They would have stoned Matthew to say, how dare you say that this list of people, these names, prove that Jesus is the Messiah, that he's some savior of the world. And why? Because as we'll see, this genealogy is unlike any other genealogy. This list of names is full of the outsiders, the outcast, the morally wrong, the people you and I would otherwise look down on. And Matthew puts them right into the birth of Jesus. And he does it because he wants to show us a couple things. First, and secondly, first, he wants us to show that this is a genealogy of grace. And specifically, it's a genealogy of grace to the outsider. It's a genealogy of grace to the outsider, but then lastly, he wants to show us that this is a genealogy of rest. It's a genealogy of rest for everyone. Grace for the outsider and rest for everyone. Let's jump into this. First of all, a genealogy of grace. If you look back at these names, some of them may not strike you right off the map. Let me break down this. Let's be real analytical, okay, for a little bit. I like this. I get to go back to my analysis days in business. Let's be real analytical. Break this genealogy down, okay? Look at it. 5 women are included. No genealogy ever included women. You list 5 women, 5 of them here. Women were never listed in genealogy because nobody ever cared who your mother was or who your grandmother was. And why? Because at the time that this was written, women didn't have rights. They couldn't legally testify in a court of law. They were considered at some places property. Women were second-class citizens. They were social outsiders. And yet Matthew says, look, I'm going to put 5, not only one, I'm going to put 5 of them into this genealogy as the way to show you that Jesus is coming as a person born of social outsiders. But not only that, if you look further in this genealogy, there are what we call Gentiles. There's a few of them. And if you were trying to prove that this was a Jewish Messiah, you would never put Gentiles like Rahab, outsiders, cultural outsiders. They would never be in this genealogy. And yet Matthew says, look, not only is Jesus a king of outsiders socially, but culturally as well. And it gets even more scandalous. Let's look at this for the next point. If you look, this genealogy includes some of the biggest spiritual outsiders in all of human history. Some people who have made the worst mistakes in their life. Some people who have screwed up so bad that I guarantee you, you and I would want nothing to do with them if they were sitting here this morning. We'd have a hard time conversing with them. Who? Well, first of all, Genesis 38, Tamar. He puts in Tamar. If you know her story, Tamar was involved in an incestual relationship. Rahab. From Joshua 2, a woman, not only a woman, but she was a prostitute. And not only that, but she was a cultural outsider. Not only that, but she betrayed her own country. She was a traitor because she helped the Jewish spies. Traitors, prostitutes, sexually immoral people. And Uriah, it says, David, he includes Uriah, and he actually says the wife of Uriah. He doesn't even talk about Bathsheba. And this is a way not to dig at Bathsheba, if you remember that story, but a way to dig at David. See, you and I would look at this and go, oh, David, he's in the genealogy. Of course, King David. He's the great king. Really? Matthew says, don't you remember what he did? He was the one who committed adultery, and then he was the one who murdered the husband to cover his own tracks. You see, in this genealogy, we have all of these outsiders, broken people, flawed people, people just like you and I. And it's Matthew's way of saying, if you come to Jesus, you come to him as an outsider, and he takes the ones who are on the outside and he puts them on the inside. Religion will tell you Do these things, and then God will love you and accept you. Matthew in this genealogy says, do you not know that God loved you even in your brokenness, your sinfulness, your condition, and he brings you on the inside, just like he did these people. Jesus says, these were my great-grandmothers, and I'm proud of it, and I'm going to write it down. Yes, they made mistakes, but I'm a God of grace, he says. And to prove it, I'm going to write down these people's names for all of history. Jesus doesn't shy away from these sinners, these morally corrupt, these outsiders. Now, isn't that a great picture? King David and prostitutes eating at the same table, the broken and the sinful, all eating together, all partaking, and all part of the grand narrative that gives you and me Christmas. That on Christmas morning, when we look at that little baby, and we remember baby Jesus, we know that he came from a line of outsiders. And when you and I are outside, God brings us inside. Not by anything we've done, and especially in light of all the wrong things we've done. Now, what's the practical implication for this? I'm gonna kind of dig this into you a little bit right now. Because I'm going to venture to say that the majority of the people in this room, you do not consider yourself an outsider necessarily, socially, culturally, whatever. I know it's a blanket statement, but I'm willing to bet that if you were to go to a party, people would want to talk to you. You could have conversation. People wouldn't shy away from you. People wouldn't turn their backs on you. People wouldn't leave you. So what does this genealogy tell you and me today? This genealogy, this list of outsiders says this: if God brought them inside, you and I are called to bring those who are outside inside. We're called to bring the people who we don't want to talk to, the people we may even look down on, the people who rub us the wrong way, the people who bother us, the people who are always cheating and stealing and lying, the people who are always manipulative and mean and crass and cross. Those outsiders, you and I bring to the inside by grace. Because it's by grace that you and I were first brought to the inside. Let's be real practical here. How do you know the outsiders in your life? Look around your life, and I'm guaranteeing it's probably the people that piss you off the most. It's probably people that rub you the wrongest way. It's probably the people you look at and say, how could they be so stupid? How could they be like that? If you can say that, you've just labeled them the outsider. And if you think about the social condition of human beings, I love, I can't even think of them offhand, these children's movies where you see the children and then later on they grow up, right? And you tend to see that people, when they're children, they grow up to be an exacerbated form of themselves, right? So in all these movies, if the kid is sort of a troublemaker, when they're the young kid, when they grow up, they become a criminal or something like that, or become a really bad person. Or I'm thinking of Stand By Me or something like that movie, where if a kid is a reader or a smart kid, he grows up to be an author or something like that. This is the social condition that we live in. The people around us that are outsiders not because they're so different from us, but because they've had a form to themselves that has become exacerbated. It's become grown into another form. C.S. Lewis refers to this as saying that somebody who grumbles all the time has now become a grumbler and has become the grumble themselves, to the point that they can't even distinguish whether they're a grumbler or the grumble. And you know these people. I know you do. People are just malcontents. People are just unhappy. They're always finding criticisms in you and in other people. They're an exacerbated form. They're a caricature of themselves. But Jesus says, look, those are exactly the people that I want you to go out and bring to the inside of your life. Because he took the people, the social outsiders, the cultural outsiders, the morally corrupt, the sinful people, the quote-unquote bad people, and he puts them in his family history. It's a genealogy of grace for the outsiders, and that means necessarily that if you and I say we follow Jesus, we are called to go find the outsiders in our lives, and by the same grace we were touched with, touch them with grace to bring them to the inside of our lives. But not only that, it's not only a genealogy of grace, but it is a genealogy of rest. It's a genealogy of rest. Now what do I mean by that? Let me explain this. Genealogies, I said, were like resumes, right? Not only were they resumes, but they were birth announcements. Okay, birth announcements. And if you've had a baby, you've sent out birth announcements. Now, a birth announcement is the factual collection of the actual story of your baby, okay? Now, let's pretend that I send out a birth announcement of my child, and somebody looks at the birth announcement and says, I'm glad this works for you, but it doesn't really work for me. This is good. As long as it works for you, that's okay. And you would look at them and go, no, wait, no. It's not like if it works for you, if it doesn't work for you. My baby was born. This is a true statement. And the person says, I know. If it works for you, that's good. I'm so glad that your baby works for you. It just doesn't work for me. See, a genealogy as a birth announcement means this: you can't approach it subjectively or relativistically. You have to approach it objectively. Either you have to throw the whole Bible out, or you have to accept this genealogy as a birth announcement of the greatest story that ever came true. You can no longer look at Jesus and say, if Jesus works for you, that's okay. No. Matthew will have none of it. Matthew, in writing this down, says you cannot relativize this. It's a birth announcement. I don't care if you think it works for you. It's the truth, and it's the truth of a story. It's the truth, and this is what Christmas is. Christmas is the story behind all stories. And every night I read, not every night, I try to read fairy tales to my daughter. Stories, all these great stories, and she just wants to hear them over and over again. And for some reason, when we get old, we lose that beauty, right? We lose the romance of a fairy tale. I mean, in theory, we may like it, but not like my daughter. She just wants to hear Cinderella over and over and over again. She wants to hear Snow White over and over and over again. And I got to thinking, why? Why is it that stories move us so much? Because deep down in all of our hearts, I believe we all crave a story. We all crave a fairy tale. We want the happy ending. And Christmas is the holiday. This birth announcement says, hey people, here's your fairy tale. Here's the happy ending. It comes with the beginning of a life and a baby. We all crave stories. I don't know, something happens when we get old, and I just wish I could go back to being like my 3-year-old daughter and wanting to hear fairy tales over and over again. And it got me thinking, I love this part of the book, Peter Pan, Wendy and Peter. I don't know if it's even included in any of the movies, but it's one of the greater parts. And there's a part where Wendy, she's captured by Hook. Peter finds out, of course, through Tinkerbell or some other method, and he's on the way to rescue Wendy. And Wendy's going back and forth with Hook in the book. And I didn't mean to rhyme that one. She's going back and forth with Hook. And Hook, Hook says, tell me about this Peter Pan. And she's telling him stories about Peter Pan. And she says, Peter came to Neverland. And Hook says, oh, that sounds great. So he must have fought pirates. And, oh, that's a great story. And Wendy said, yeah, but when he got to Neverland, he was a little sad. And Hook says, why was he sad? And she says, well, because he didn't have a Wendy. He missed his Wendy. And Hook looks at her quizzically and says, what do you mean he didn't have a Wendy? What does that mean? And she said, he didn't have someone to tell him the stories that he loved the most. And Hook goes to her and says, well, what stories did you tell? You remember Peter Pan used to stay outside of her window listening to every story that Wendy would tell. And Wendy says, oh, I would tell him all the wonderful stories. The stories of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, and she goes on. And Hook interrupts her and he says, aha, all the love stories, the stories of love, that's what he likes. And she says, no. These were stories of adventure, where good always triumphed over evil, and good always defeated the bad. She says, that's what Peter Pan longed for, and he was sad when he couldn't get it. And to be honest, you've got to admit today, there's a little Peter Pan in all of us, right? We all want a story. A story behind all stories, something to make sense of things, something where we know that the good in life overcomes the bad, something that we know all the suffering that we go through is going to make sense because something defeats it and something takes care of it. And all the loneliness we feel will be fixed. We all want that story. We crave that one. And Christmas is the one that says, here's the story behind all stories. That the God of the universe would stoop down so low to become a baby. If you want a fairy tale, if you want a story of rest, if you want a story that gives you the answers to all of your problems, it's this story. It's a genealogy. It's a birth announcement. It's a baby. And I wish we had more time to go into the numbers. I read the part that says there's 14 generations, 14. Let me sum it up this way. I don't want to do biblical math this morning. I know none of you want that on a cold winter morning. Let's summarize this biblical math. What Matthew is saying, 7 is the perfect number, obviously, in the Bible. And on the seventh day, God rested. And so if you add 7 and 7, you get an even better number. And he's saying there's 14, and 14. Here's the summary. He's saying that this little baby Jesus, for you and for me, will be the ultimate rest. That everything in history led up to the birth of this Jesus. It was all mathematically figured. It was all laid out in a Sabbath rest pattern. And God says, if you want rest in your life, you only get it by acknowledging him as your king. Now, how does that happen? How does those things, what happens when you acknowledge Jesus as your king? How do you suddenly start to get rest? Here's how it works. Because you and I can let go. If we know that the greatest fairy tale ever written has a happy ending, then we don't have to go around trying to fix other people or fix ourselves or fix our situation. We don't have to go around trying to control every variable of life. We don't have to go around in anxiety. We don't have to go around in worry. Why? Because we have rest. The cross reminds us. Christmas tells us that God broke through on one morning to give you and me a little baby who would be for us grace and rest. And he's the only God who does it, and why? It's because he looks at you and me in our brokenness. Do you think we're any better than those people listed in the genealogy? No, we're not. God looks at us and says, you have made every mistake in your life. You have followed every selfish desire that you want. You have gone to do nothing for other people but serve yourself. You seek your own glory at every turn of the corner of your life. And I'm going to save you from that. And I know that you're broken. And I know all those little secrets that you have. And I know all those things you don't like to tell other people because you're embarrassed. I know them, God says, and the baby, Jesus, is proof that I still love you. There's a thing that I'd like to whip out every once in a while. My wife reminded me that I've used this a couple times. I love it. It's from a movie, and it's an older movie. Well, it's older for some of you because I'm feeling old these days, called The Fisher King, and stars Robin Williams and now I'm blanking on the other guy's name. Anyway, this character Jack finds Perry. Perry is Robin Williams. And it's the best illustration of this. Jack takes Perry, this homeless guy. Perry's homeless, Robin Williams is, but he's very witty. He's a very intelligent guy. He's a little bit crazy, actually. And Jack, one of the lead characters, has done a horrible thing in his life, and so he wants to make up for it. So he goes and finds this Perry guy, and he figures, if I clean Perry up, if I make him clean and respectable, then I'll have sort of solved my demons. And so he does that. Throughout the movie, he cleans Perry up, this homeless guy, gives him suits, tries to get him a job. Throughout the course of the movie, though, as Perry's getting cleaned up, he falls in love with Lydia, this girl Lydia. And of course, because he's homeless, he gets to follow her all around the city. He follows her all around, and he falls in love with Lydia. And finally, they go on a date. And they're done with the date, and they're at the door, and they're about to say goodbye. And Lydia looks at him and says, "Don't bother calling me." And of course, Perry's, "What? I thought we had a great date." And she said, "We did, But once you get to know me, you're not going to like me. So don't even bother. And she goes on, and Perry's trying to get a word in, and she's going on saying, just don't bother with it, don't come upstairs, don't call me, just don't worry about it, because as soon as you get to know me, you're not going to like me, because when you get to know everything inside of me, you're just going to run away like everybody else has. And she's going on, and Perry all of a sudden just has to interrupt her, and he yells at her, Robin Williams' character, and he stops her, and he says this, and I put it in your outline. He says to Lydia, I love you, and it's not just from tonight. I've known you for a long time. I see you come out of work every day. I walk with you to lunch. I know what you order. I see you buy baby roots before going back in. I know how you feel on certain days by whether or not you go to the bookstore. I know you hate your job, and I know you don't have many friends, and you sometimes feel like you're not as wonderful as everybody else, and you're a little uncoordinated and feeling like you're the only one who's as separate and as alone as you are. And I love you, I love you, I love you. I think you're the greatest thing since spice racks. Spice racks are great, aren't they? One of the greatest inventions. And wouldn't you love somebody to look at you and say, I know you, I see you. I see you go in and out. I see you covering, I see you hiding. I see you putting up a front to everything else in your life, and I love you. And on Christmas, this is what God says to us through his son Jesus. I see you, I know you, and I love you. That's the cross. That's the gospel. That's Christmas. Pray with me now.